Hey everybody, welcome back to another tier list. Today we're going to be going through the discography of the Boston band the Pixies, an incredibly important band to the genre of alternative rock, and a group that really carved out their own unique sound that fused together so many different elements and would end up being a key influence to many different pivotal rock groups such as Nirvana, Radiohead, Weezer, and Pavement, among many, many others. And they were yet another band that put out a handful of albums in the late 80s and early 90s and would take a pretty long hiatus before reuniting and giving us another 4 albums throughout the 2010s and early 2020s, and they are currently still active and touring to this day, which is very exciting. So a great band to be covering for today's episode. And what I'm going to do is go through their 8 studio albums, starting with Surfer Rosa and going up to Dogar Roll. And I will score each of them on this tier list, with S being the highest and D being the lowest. And I'll talk a little bit about each album, let you know my thoughts, and we will see where we end up. And please feel free to let me know your thoughts in the comments, where you agree and disagree and how you would rank these 8 albums. I would love to hear your thoughts. All right, I think that's about it. Let's jump right into it. Okay, starting out, we have their debut studio album from 1988 titled Surfer Rosa, and I will give this one an A. I know some people are going to disagree with this first score. I know it's commonly regarded as their best album amongst a lot of Pixies fans, and I certainly understand why people feel that way, but for me personally, I do think that they have stronger albums, and there are a few things about this record that I'm not super crazy about, but the good qualities largely outweigh the negative ones, and I can completely understand why this album was as influential as it was and how it was really responsible for reshaping alternative rock music. It's a very bold and brave album with all sorts of twists and turns, and from one track to the next, you have no idea what you're going to be hit with, which I think is a core ingredient of that Pixies flavor and one of the big reasons as to why people love their sound so much. And this album certainly delivers on that front. It's got 13 tracks, and I do think the majority of the songs on here are very solid. I think for me personally, I do resonate more with some of the tracks on the albums that would follow it, but that's just a preference on my part. The production is more raw on this one, and of all of their albums, this is the one that features Kim Deal the most prominently on the vocals, and that is actually an element of this album that I really enjoy. Anytime a band has a nice male and female vocal trade-off, I always enjoy that, and this is definitely an album that is a great example of that. For me, the tracks that are the big high points of this would be the opening 2, Bone Machine and Break My Body, as well as Gigantic, which was actually the only single for this album, as well as River Euphrates, obviously Where Is My Mind, and the closing track, Brick is Red. And while I do enjoy most of the songs on here, it does have a couple of tracks that fall a little flat for me, and they actually all happen in succession from tracks 10 to 12, with Oh My Golly, Vamos, and I'm Amazed. None of these songs really do anything for me, and ultimately these 3 tracks are the reason why I put this in A tier as opposed to S. I'm just not crazy about the stylistic choices that they made on those particular songs, but regardless of that, I think the remainder of the album is very strong, with a handful of really exceptional tracks like Where Is My Mind, Bone Machine, Gigantic, and River Euphrates. And like I said, I can certainly understand why this album had such an impact and was so groundbreaking for 1988. And I do think that it is a great introduction to the unique songwriting style of Black Francis, and I greatly respect his willingness to write with such bravery and just never to conform to any musical norms throughout this record. And I think that is ultimately why this album is held in such high regard and ended up being such a huge influence on future bands and records, with the big one being Nirvana's Nevermind, which is considered one of the greatest grunge albums of all time and also one of the greatest 90s records of all time. So I certainly understand the love for this album on that front, but like I said, for me personally, I do think they have stronger records that follow it. But in the midst of that, there is still a lot of amazing stuff all throughout this, and it is definitely one of the most classic and influential alt-rock albums of all time. So a very good debut album. This one gets an A. Okay, next we have their second studio album from 1989 titled Doolittle, and this one gets an easy S. Probably no big surprises here. An absolutely insane album, and regarded by many as the best Pixies album. I think they took everything that they established on Surfer Rosa and enhanced it even more. The production is cleaner, the music contains everything that I love about the Pixies sound. There's great melodies, there's noise and chaos, there's a lot of adventure and unpredictability unpredictability from track to track, but at the same time, it's packaged in a way that feels very cohesive, and they do a great job of incorporating some new stylistic elements that don't clash with each other. And from front to back, it is just filled with one amazing song after another. It's got 15 tracks, opening up with Debaser, which is in my opinion the best opening track of any Pixies album, bringing things in the most tasteful and energetic way possible. And as soon as you hear that opening guitar part, it's clear how much more refined and how much cleaner the production is, and the momentum just keeps up for the rest of the album. We have a great mix of some songs that incorporate some noisier or dissonant guitar and vocal parts, with songs like Tame, Dead, and Crackety Jones. We have really catchy and beautiful vocal melodies and choruses on songs like Wave of Mutilation, Here Comes Your Man, Monkey Gone to Heaven, La La Love You, There Goes My Gun, Silver, and Gouge Away. And they really managed to capture this perfect blend of alternative rock, art punk, noise rock, and a little bit of pop sprinkled in as well. And it results in a very adventurous and enjoyable album that, in my opinion, would definitely be a contender for the top 10 albums of the 80s. My personal favorite tracks on here are Debaser, Monkey Gone to Heaven, Wave of Mutilation, There Goes My Gun, and the closer, Gouge Away. Gouge Away is, in my opinion, also the strongest closing track of any Pixies album. So another huge thing in favor of this record is that I think Debaser and Gouge Away are the strongest opening and closing tracks of any of their albums. And if I was going to give this album any sort of mild critique, the only thing I would say is that I wouldn't have minded if Kim had a few more vocal tracks on here, because I really like how prevalent she was on the first release, but she definitely has some moments throughout this on tracks like I Bleed, La La, I Love You, There Goes My Gun, and Silver, but I certainly wouldn't have objected to a couple of more tracks where she's doing lead vocal parts. And at this point in the band, some tension had started to develop between Kim and Black Francis because of Kim wanting more creative control but not getting it. And unfortunately, this would be the start of what would inevitably result in her leaving the band after their fourth record. But regardless of that, this is an absolutely incredible album that I cannot say enough good things about. So this one gets an easy S. All right, moving on, we have their third studio album from 1990 titled Bossa NOA, and I will give this one an S. Another incredible album, and this is actually my favorite Pixies album. I love Doolittle as well, but for me personally, this one has more of my favorite Pixies songs, and just stylistically, I resonate even more with the direction that they took on this album. It's got 14 songs, and again, lots of stylistic variety from track to track, never knowing what's coming next, and containing all of those same elements that I loved on Doolittle, with the melodic elements, the noisy and dissonant elements, the unusual chord voicings on select songs, and the general unpredictability and chaos that can ensue from one song to the next. It opens up wonderfully with a super badass and hard-hitting surf rock instrumental titled Cecilia Ann, which is a cover of a song by the Surf Tones, and then from there we are off with one great track after the next. I love Rock Music as a follow-up track. Black Francis's screaming vocals kickstart the album with such an aggressive feel that I love so much, and then that is followed up by my favorite track of the entire album titled Valoria, a perfect song and one that would easily make my top 3 favorite Pixies song list. So an absolutely incredible start to the album, and in my opinion the momentum stays strong for the remainder of it, alternating vibes and styles in a similar way to Doolittle. And I would say that it is slightly less heavy though from this point on. I think after track 2, which was Rock Music, I think the heaviest part of the album is over at that point, but there are a lot of really standout tracks in the remainder of this track listing, with songs like Anna, All Over the World, The Happening, Hangwire, and the closer Javelina, which has some really interesting and dissonant chord voicings in the guitar, which I love so much. I love the vocal layering between Frank and Kim on this one as well. A really beautiful closer to an incredible album. And typically most people will either say Bossa NOA, Doolittle, or Surfer Rosa are their best albums, and I tend to fall in the Bossa NOA camp. Like I said, for me personally, it's got the largest amount of my favorite Pixies songs, with tracks like Valoria, Rock Music, All Over the World, The Happening, and Cecilia Ann, even though it's technically a cover song. But I cannot say enough good things about this album. My number 1 favorite Pixies album, and one of my favorite albums of 1990 as well. So this one gets an easy S. All right, next we have their fourth studio album from 1991 titled Trompe le Monde, and I will also give this one an S. Another amazing album. I would say I like it slightly less than Doolittle and Bossan NOA, but still definitely good enough to qualify for S tier in my opinion. And I think it's a really great follow-up to those two albums and does a great job of contrasting it very nicely. We still have those very similar elements with the adventurous writing and lots of stylistic variety from track to track. Black Francis continues to stretch out his vocal range and stylings. I love his unique ability to completely change the timbre of his voice from one track to the next. I love the way the production sounds on this, and this probably also has my favorite guitar work of any Pixies album. As a guitar player, I find that this album has a lot of moments that really catch my ear, which is something I really appreciate. The album has 15 tracks, and I think the overwhelming majority of the songs on here are rock solid. The title track brings things in with a great energy, and from that point on, they hit us with some incredible songs. And the big thing for me that is a huge plus with this album is that it contains my number one favorite Pixie song, which is Alec Eiffel. I think everything about that song is perfect, and the instrumental section at the end of the song is one of my favorite moments of any Pixie song. Such a beautiful melody, a great groove, just so much great stuff all packed into one section. My other favorites on here would be the Jesus and Mary Chain cover of Head On, as well as Letter to Memphis, Motorway to Roswell, and the Navajo No, which I think is such a cool closing track. I do think that Doolittle and Bossan NOA have more individual standout tracks than this one does, but there really aren't any tracks on here that I dislike, and I think from front to back it's a very solid and consistent album with a couple of songs that are incredible. And like I said, it has my number one favorite Pixies song, which is Alec Eiffel, so that's something that is hugely in favor of this album. But regardless of that, it is still an amazing album with a ton of great tracks. So this one gets an S. Okay, next we have their fifth studio album from 2014 titled Indie Cindy. Before I score this, I'll give a little backstory as to how this album came to be. So the band would break up in 1993, and 10 years later they would reunite in 2003 and do a reunion tour in 2004, and they would release one new single and would continue doing performances for years without any new album getting released. And unfortunately, the tension between Kim and Black Francis would resurface, and that would result in Kim leaving the band in 2013. And after this decision, the group would go on to release 3 EPs, which would eventually be compiled into one album and would end up being released as this album. As far as scoring goes, I will give this a B. I think this album is pretty good, but definitely not amazing, and it doesn't hit me the same way that the original 4 records do. And from a composition and production standpoint, this is definitely some new territory compared to the original 4 albums, which is not a huge surprise given how long of a gap it's been since the previous release. But in the midst of that, I still think there is a handful of really enjoyable songs throughout this record. I think it opens up incredibly strong. I really love the first 3 songs. It opens up with What Goes Boom, which brings things in with a very heavy and intense vibe that I absolutely love. I was really surprised to hear that, and some of the heavier vocal parts on this one almost remind me of Tool. I've always wondered if anyone else ever felt the same way about this track. And then that is followed up with Greens and Blues, which is a more straightforward alt-rock track that sounds more like classic Pixies, but probably a little safer, I would say, than a lot of the stuff on the first 4 albums, but another great track nonetheless. And then that is followed up by the title track, which is a very cool song with interesting grooves and a unique energy to it, mixing the energetic dialogue with a more chill vocal section. And for me personally, this is the strongest part of the album, and from this point on, it does still have some songs that I find very enjoyable, but it will also have a couple of tracks I don't find particularly exciting, and that is ultimately why I put this in B tier. For the remainder of the album, the tracks that stick out to me are Magdalena 318, Silver Snail, Ring the Bell, Snakes, and Jamie Bravo. Magdalena 318 has a nice dark and eerie energy to it, and so does Silver Snail. Ring the Bell is a very beautiful song with a catchy chorus and another more feel-good track in a similar vein to Greens and Blues. Snakes is a really solid song with a catchy chorus and again more of a mysterious and eerie energy to it. And then Jamie Bravo is another great track that ends the album very nicely. So as you can see, there still is a good chunk of this album that I do really enjoy. and a lot of these songs still contain those elements that I love from the Pixies, and I do think they do a pretty good job of redefining their sound for a 2010s musical landscape, but at the same time, it still does feel like there is something missing from this album when you compare it to the original 4 releases. But regardless of that, I think this record is still very enjoyable for what it is, and it is definitely not my least favorite record of theirs. It does contain a couple of songs that I do think are incredible, like What Goes Boom, Greens and Blues, Ring the Bell, and Snakes. So not their best album, but not a terrible reunion record either, so I will give this one a B. Okay, next we have their 6th studio album from 2016 titled Head Carrier, and unfortunately I'm going to give this one a C. I'm not a huge fan of this album. I do consider it to be a bit of a downgrade from Indie Cindy. Stylistically, I would say it is similar to the previous release and a continuation on a lot of the sounds that they had developed on that record, but I do think the songwriting is a little more dull and uninteresting throughout this, and it doesn't have as many standout tracks as Indie Cindy does for me. Similar to the previous album, I do think it starts out very strong with the opening 2 tracks, Head Carrier and Classic Masher. Head Carrier is a super badass and hard-hitting track that brings in the album with a great intensity, and then Classic Masher contrasts it very nicely, giving us more of a straight-ahead alt-rock track that's very catchy and has a really pretty chorus. And when I initially put this album on, I was very hopeful after hearing the first 2 tracks, and I really thought that this album was going to be amazing, but unfortunately from this point on, I do think that the album takes a pretty big dip in momentum, and a good chunk of the remainder of the track listing are songs that I find pretty trite and flat sounding. Really, the only couple of songs that I enjoy throughout the remainder of this are Might As Well Be Gone, Una, Bel Esprit, and All I Think About Now, which is a very nice lead vocal feature of Paz Len Chanton, the new bass player. And while I enjoy these 4 tracks, at the same time, I wouldn't say that any of them are really exceptional songs that would make my top favorite Pixies track list. For me, the 2 favorites on this album would definitely be the opening 2 tracks. The opening title track in particular, I think, is hands down the coolest and most unique song from this album, and I find a good chunk of the songs on here to be lacking a lot of those exciting and unpredictable elements that I love about the Pixies' writing style. And I would say that this album probably contains the largest amount of their most generic and boring sounding songs. So it's got a few songs that I find really enjoyable, but I do find the majority of this album pretty bland, and I think it's a bit of a downgrade from the quality of tracks that we heard on Indie Cindy. So not a great album in my opinion. I will give this one a C. Okay, next we have their 7th studio album from 2020 titled Beneath the Eerie, and I'm probably going to surprise some people with this one, but I'm going to give this an A. I know some people are going to think it's insane that I'm putting this in the same tier as Surfer Rosa, and I will say up front that I do like Surfer Rosa a bit more, but I also really enjoy this album and consider it to be a big improvement from Head Carrier, and I think it's a lot better than a lot of people give it credit for. And it's funny because initially when I first put this album on, I really wasn't crazy about it, but the more I listened to it, the more and more it grew on me. And I think the reason why a lot of people don't like this one is because stylistically, I would say it sounds a lot more different from the previous 2 albums. And maybe because of that, subconsciously, I was resisting it at first. But the more I listened to it, the more and more I liked it. And I do think the majority of the songs on this album are very enjoyable. This album was recorded in a remote converted church in New York, and a lot of the surroundings of that environment had influenced the writing on this album. And this one has some similar stylistic tendencies to the previous 2 albums, but it also veers off into more of a gothic rock style for a good chunk of the record, which gives it a bit of a darker mood. And Black Francis is experimenting with more lower pitched vocal melodies on select tracks, which gives me hints of Tom Waits and Nick Cave. The album has 12 tracks, and I really enjoy almost every song on here. There's really only 2 songs on here that I'm not crazy about, so the ratio of good to bad songs is pretty good. I think tracks 1 through 5 are a very solid succession of songs, one great track after the next, and my 2 favorite songs from the album happen at that point with Catfish Kate and Ready for Love. I do think the second half of the album gets slightly less exciting than the first half, but it still contains a handful of really awesome tracks. For me, the 2 songs on here that I'm not crazy about happen in the second half of the album, and those songs are Silver Bullet and Los Surfers Muertos. My two favorite songs from the second half would be Long Rider and Bird of Prey. So in general, I think the songwriting is much more interesting on this one than it was on the previous releases. Stylistically, they are trying out a lot of new things. Black Francis is trying out some new vocal stylings that we hadn't heard before, and just the general mood and vibe of this album I think provides a really nice change of pace from what we heard on the previous two releases. It does a really great job of contrasting it and giving us a new side of the Pixies that they had been exploring at the time of writing this album. So a very good record and a big improvement from the previous release in my opinion, so this one gets an A. Okay, and lastly, we have their 8th and most recent studio album from 2022 titled Dogar Roll, and I will give this one a B. I think this album is pretty good. I don't like it as much as Beneath the Eerie, but I definitely think it is stronger than Head Carrier, and if I was comparing it to Indie Cindy, I think I probably like Indie Cindy slightly more from an individual song standpoint, but I would say this one is not far off from that. This one has 12 tracks, and I think about 3/4 of the songs on here are enjoyable. I wouldn't say it has any tracks that would make my favorite Pixies song list, but they are still enjoyable for what they are. I think the opening 3 tracks in particular are very strong, and that would probably be my favorite succession of songs from this album, with No Matter Day, Vault of Heaven, and Dregs of the Wine. And it's funny because I think the 3 tracks that follow that are actually all pretty underwhelming and generic sounding songs, and that would be my least favorite succession of songs on the album. So it's an interesting opening 6 tracks for me personally, but for the remaining half of the album, there are a couple of other tracks that I think are really solid, and a couple that I also find kind of dull. I really enjoy Thunder and Lightning. There's a Moon On, I think, has a particularly strong chorus. Who's More Sorry Now is fine, and You're Such a Sadducee is a really cool second to last track. I do find Pagan Man kind of dull, and I'm really not a fan of the title track, Dogar Roll, which concludes the album. For whatever reason, that song just doesn't do anything for me, no matter how many times I listen to it, and I do think it is probably the weakest closing track of any Pixies album. But regardless of the tracks that I'm not crazy about on here, there are definitely some high points. My personal favorites on here would be Vault of Heaven, Dregs of the Wine, and There's a Moon On. And I do think the good tracks do outweigh the weaker tracks, and I think for 2022 Pixies, they are still producing some really solid songs, and they still have a lot left to give us based on how this album came out. So, not a bad album, but not amazing, somewhere in between. I will give this one a B. All right, we did it. We went through their 8 studio albums, and this is what I came up with. I definitely needed to put a good amount of thought into a couple of the later albums and give them a few more listens to really solidify my thoughts, but after a few listens, I can confidently say that this is my ranking of their discography. Such an amazing band that really put out some of the most unique music of the late 80s and early 90s, and continues to deliver solid tracks and solid albums to this day, which we are very grateful to be a part of, and obviously their influence on alternative rock cannot be overstated. I would say they are one of the most important bands to come out of the late 80s and have influenced countless bands that are just too many to even name. So just really an incredible band that I'm glad to have finally covered for today's episode. So that is it for today. Thank you so much for watching. I hope it was enjoyable. And if you are interested, please feel free to check out some of my other tier lists, which will be linked in the comments and the description, and see if there's anything else that you might like. And like I said, please feel free to let me know your thoughts in the comments, where you agree and disagree, and how you would rank these 8 albums. I would love to hear your thoughts. All right, that's it for today. Thanks again for listening, and I will see you at the next video. Take care.